Welcome to the third and final Uehiro lecture from Professor Tim Scanlon from Harvard University. Tonight the plan will be Tim will talk for about 55 minutes, and then we have three commentators who will each give some comments for up to 15 minutes each, and Professor Scanlon will respond to them each in turn, and then we'll have a general discussion. So we will run longer than the previous two nights, so if you are exhausted after the commentaries, please feel free to relieve yourselves. So the third lecture in the series, When Does Equality Matter, is equal opportunity.
Thank you very much. One objection to economic inequality, I've said in my previous lectures, is that it can undermine the fairness of political institutions and make it impossible to achieve economic equality of opportunity. In this lecture, I will explore this objection in more detail, concentrating on equality of economic opportunity. My question will be how this requirement should be understood and how it is justified. The arguments for equality of opportunity seem to me to be surprisingly difficult to discern and relatively under-discussed, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that it is so widely accepted, or at least so widely paid lip service to. Because equality of opportunity is compatible with unequal rewards, and appears to say nothing about how these inequalities themselves should be limited or justified, it has something of a bad name among many egalitarians, who may say that it is not really an egalitarian doctrine at all, or that it is a myth promulgated in order to make unacceptable inequalities seem acceptable. And as Brian Barry pointed out, if having the opportunity for something means being able to take some course of action that would lead to one's actually getting it, then what is commonly called equality of opportunity is not really such. If positions and rewards are handed out on the basis of abilities, and not everyone has or could develop these abilities, then some people have no opportunity to receive them. So if equality of opportunity means anything, it must be understood in some other way. No doubt the idea of equality of opportunity is often misused in these ways. Properly understood, however, it's not a justification for inequality, but an independent requirement that must be satisfied if inequalities are to be just. If this requirement is taken seriously, I think, its bad reputation is undeserved, since it can have strong egalitarian implications. The requirement of equal opportunity can be seen as arising as part of the following three-level justification for inequality. Suppose that a person objects to the fact that he or she is not as well off economically as someone else, or to the fact that someone else occupies a position with powers and prerogatives of office that this person would like to have. A satisfactory response to such a complaint would, I believe, involve three claims. The first claim is the claim that it is justified to have a position to which greater economic rewards or special powers and opportunities are attached in this way. The second claim is that there was no unfairness in the process through which this other person was selected for the position in question. The other person was more qualified for that position than the complainant. But the third claim that has to be made to complete the justification is that there was no wrong involved in the fact that the complainant didn't have the qualifications that were as good as the other person's. These claims constitute what I will refer to as the three-level justification for an inequality. The key to the idea of equality of opportunity, I believe, lies in understanding the relation between these levels of justification and the proper division of justificatory labor between them. The first of these claims might be supported by arguing that the inequality in question satisfies Rawls's difference principle. On the other hand, some might believe that this justification, that is the justification for having the unequal positions to begin with, can be adequately supported by arguing that having such positions is economically efficient, or that these positions arise from interactions between individuals exercising their property and contract rights. The second claim, the claim that there was no unfairness involved in the selection process through which the other person was chosen for some beneficial position, the second claim states what I will call the requirement of formal equality of opportunity. It applies to the process of selection among those who present themselves as candidates for some position. It says that preference must not be given to candidates on the basis of factors that are irrelevant to their qualification for that position. Irrelevant, that is, to their ability to perform the job, or in the case of education, relevant to make best use of the kind of education in question. This rules out discrimination on racial or other grounds, but also nepotism and other kinds of favoritism, as well as failure to consider the candidates on their merits out of pure laziness. Those of you who during this hiring season are spending a lot of time reading folders know this temptation well. The third claim, which states what I will call substantive equality of opportunity, requires more than this. It applies not only to the selection among candidates, but also to the conditions that determine who can acquire the qualifications to be a candidate. Rawls calls this stronger requirement fair equality of opportunity, and he states it as follows. Those who are at the same level of talent and ability, and have the same willingness to use them, should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. This rules out a system in which talented individuals born into poorer families lack conditions required in order to develop their talents and thus qualify for positions of special advantage, even if the selection for these positions itself is administered without bias or favoritism. The motivational condition included in Rawls's definition, quote, and have similar willingness to use them, raises further questions to which I will return. As long as there is significant economic inequality between families, certainly anything like the degree of inequality that prevails in the societies we are familiar with, or prevailed in these societies even before 1990, it is almost certain, this inequality is almost certain to affect the early training that children receive, to affect their success in school and their relative ability to compete for the positions to which special rewards are attached. One way to meet the requirement of fair equality of opportunity would be to provide assistance to poor children which would overcome this deficit. I will discuss measures of this kind later in my lecture. But as Rawls says, it is difficult to see how fair equality of opportunity could be achieved by such measures alone in a society in which rewards were determined solely by the market. At least, Rawls says, as long as some form of the family exists. If it cannot be achieved, then fair equality of opportunity requires that these inequalities be eliminated, or at least reduced. Thus, Rawls believed that this difficulty would be much less in a society, much less severe, in a society in which inequality was constrained by his difference principle. But understood in this way, fair equality of opportunity remains a very strong egalitarian requirement, perhaps as strong as the difference principle itself. That is, if you met the requirements of fair equality of opportunity by equalizing starting places, how much work would there be left for the difference principle to do to constrain inequalities? In this strong form, equality of opportunity serves as a kind of egalitarian Trojan horse. Achieving it requires, if not equality of outcomes, then at least something much closer to it than we have seen in most of the societies with which we are familiar. I'm here referring to the fact that at least in the United States, the voice you commonly hear from the right says, yes, we are all in favor of equality of opportunity. It's equality of outcomes that we object to as too much of a constraint. And what I'm saying is if you take equality of opportunity in this serious form, it amounts to something pretty close to equality of outcomes. Not all the way, but it certainly is a severe constraint. Given the strength of this strong idea of equality of opportunity, it is perhaps surprising that equality of opportunity is widely endorsed, even, as I've just said, by many on the right, as is indicated by the frequently heard claim that even a poor child who works hard can grow up to be rich. What explains this, perhaps, is a failure on the part of the people who say things like this to take seriously what would actually be required in order to make it true. Despite this lip service, however, the idea of equality of opportunity in this strong form, fair equality of opportunity as opposed to merely formal equality of opportunity, is very controversial. Friedrich Hayek, for one, firmly rejected substantive equality of opportunity while accepting the weaker form reversion, which he understood to mean the absence of discrimination and a policy of careers open to talent. He writes, for example, that there is no more reason to object to differences in children's prospects that result from differences in family wealth than there is to object to differences that result from their different genetic endowments, which they also inherit from their parents. His thought, perhaps, is that neither of these factors is under a person's control, and therefore that a child deserves no more credit for his talents than for the money he inherits from his family. Robert Nozick also rejected equality of opportunity in this strong form. Interestingly, James Buchanan, although generally classified as a libertarian, endorsed a requirement of access to opportunity, if not full equality, which he believed was unrealizable. When, he said, there is only one game in town, everyone has to be given a fair chance of playing. Buchanan believed that differences in family circumstances were the main source of unfairness in this regard. To counteract this unfairness, he held, good public education had to be provided for all, and there had to be limits on the intergenerational transfer of wealth through bequests. And these, he said, should be constitutional requirements in any just regime, even if having these requirements involved some sacrifice in liberty and some sacrifice in economic efficiency. It's an interesting question, I think, why Buchanan took this relatively strong line despite his firm commitment to free market principles. The answer, I believe, lies in the subtitle of his article. The article that I quoted from was called Rules for a Fair Game, Contractarian Notes on Distributive Justice. Unlike Hayek, who was mainly, although not exclusively, a kind of consequentialist, Buchanan was a contractarian. In fact, he had a long and respectful intellectual correspondence with John Rawls, something I think that one could not imagine Friedrich Hayek engaging in. As a contractarian, Buchanan took seriously the idea that institutions must be justifiable to each individual who is asked to accept and abide by them. And he thought that one could not ask individuals to accept and abide by the rules of a game that they had no alternative to play if they didn't have a fair chance to get into the game. Given its strength, especially understood in this stronger way, substantive equality of opportunity needs some justification. I will return in a moment to the question of how that justification might be provided. First, as background for this, I want to consider the case for formal equality of opportunity. Although this requirement is less demanding, it still requires some defense. Formal equality of opportunity is often equated with a policy of careers open to talent, which can be understood in two different ways. It can be understood as the absence of discrimination, that is to say, no one is barred from applying, or as a requirement that people who do apply are selected for the positions in question on the basis of their merit for those positions. These are two different ideas, non-discrimination and careers open to talent, which have quite different implications. Merit-based selection rules out not only outright discrimination, but also nepotism, cronyism, and simple laziness in screening the applicants. Non-discrimination and merit-based selection also have different justificatory bases. I will consider the case for merit-based selection. The case for this lies initially in the first level of the three-level justification that I outlined above, namely the fact, if it is a fact, that the justification for having the positions of advantage in question is that if these positions are filled by individuals with certain abilities, then this will have beneficial consequences of the right kind. These consequences might simply be the consequence of promoting economic efficiency, or perhaps more strongly, fulfilling Rawls's difference principle, that is, promoting the greater productivity in a way that, through distribution, makes everyone better off. If the positions are justified in this way, but individuals were then selected for these positions on some basis other than their possession of the relevant abilities, then the positions would not actually be being administered in a way that fit with the justification that was offered for them. I will call this the top-down justification for merit-based selection. Right? So merit-based selection, the requirement of merit-based selection for a position is just a corollary, you might say, from the justification for having those positions to begin with. Now, if the inequalities in question are not justified in one of the ways I've described, by conformity to Rawls' difference principle or the promotion of economic efficiency, then there would seem to be no basis for merit-based selection, no relevant standard of merit. If, for example, it solves a coordination problem to assign someone the role of directing what others will do, but this role requires no special skill, then selection of people for this role on the basis of some personal characteristic or other would seem to be merely a form of discrimination. Perhaps fairness would require assignment by lot. Alternatively, if the justification for the position in question lies, as Nozick would have it, simply with the fact that it has been created by some agent using resources that he or she is entitled to control, then again this would imply no moral requirement of merit-based selection. Perhaps it would be irrational for the agent to select people on some basis other than their skills related to the job, but this would only be irrational, not morally wrong. Whether there would be an objection to discrimination in such cases would be a further question. This top-down justification explains why selection according to merit is not open to the objection that it distributes rewards on a basis that is, to use a much abused and misunderstood phrase, arbitrary from a moral point of view. Because the talents that are rewarded are not under a person's control and are not things for which the person can claim no credit, and are things for which the person can claim no credit. Given that they are not under the person's control and are things for which the person can claim more credit, it might be thought that even selection according to merit was selection according to factors, in this phrase, arbitrary from a moral point of view. To say that a characteristic is arbitrary from a moral point of view, however, is just to say, in my view, that it does not in itself justify any special rewards, that it is not a desert basis in the sense I described in my previous lecture. This does not mean that it would be unjust or morally objectionable for a distribution of benefits to track the presence of this characteristic under certain conditions. Rawls's famous use of the phrase in section 12 of Theory of Justice is often understood in this latter way, that is, that it's an objection to a system if it allows rewards to track, that is, march along with, correspond to, factors arbitrary from a moral point of view, that is, factors over which the person has no control and can claim no credit. As Jerry Cohen and others have pointed out, the difference principle itself allows inequalities that favor those with certain talents over which they had no control. So Rawls would be inconsistent if he understood the idea of moral arbitrariness in the latter way. There is, however, no inconsistency in his position if the phrase is understood in the way I propose. Under the difference principle, special rewards for individuals with special talents are justified by the fact that having such positions benefits everyone. That is to say, by the consequences of an institution that rewards these talents. If that's the justification for the unequal rewards, then they are not being justified on the basis of factors arbitrary from a moral point of view, since the fact that rewarding people with these talents, with these special positions, benefits everybody is not a morally arbitrary factor. As I've said, not all deviations from merit-based selection are instances of discrimination. As I explained in my previous lecture, discrimination, for example on racial, gender, or other grounds, occurs when some people are systematically excluded from valued positions and perhaps denied associational goods on grounds of their supposed inferiority and unsuitability for these goods or positions. When such a practice exists, it becomes wrong to exclude individuals from positions or other benefits on the ground of their having these characteristics, such as on grounds of race or sex. Systematic denial of valued positions to those who lack the talent for them doesn't count as discrimination in this sense, insofar as such choices, that is, whether to give them the position or not on this basis, are justified. Although, as I remarked near the end of my previous lecture, this can possibly have some of the bad effects that actual discrimination has, and we need to explain why those bad effects don't give rise to a conclusive objection. That's what I addressed last time. Let me mention now some possible shortcomings of this top-down rationale for a process of merit-based selection. First, this rationale may seem to depend too heavily on what the aims or ends of an institution in question happen to be. Couldn't an institution have aims that improperly favor or disfavor some particular group? At some period in history, I believe it was in the 1950s or perhaps after, the law school at the University of Texas in the United States was charged by the Justice Department with improper racial discrimination on the ground that they wouldn't admit blacks to the law school. And they justified this on the ground that the purpose of this law school is to promote the development of the economy of the state of Texas. And no law firm in Texas would hire a black lawyer, and no corporation in Texas needing a lawyer would go to a firm that had black lawyers. So it would be a pointless waste of the state's money to spend it educating black lawyers. It wouldn't serve their purpose, which was this. So there's a question, there's an idea where merit-based selection relative to the purposes seems too shallow, right? So one has to say, when I said that the criteria of merit in my second stage of justification are derivative upon the justification for having the positions of inequality in question. In this case, it's getting admission to the law school. I didn't mean that the merit-based selection can be based on just any purposes that somebody might think justified having the inequality in question, right? It has to be based on reasons that really justify having the institution in question. And I would argue, as even our Supreme Court accepted, that the justification offered by the state of Texas didn't meet that test. So I don't believe that this dependence of merit-based selection on the justification for the inequalities in question is open to the objection that I just mentioned. Second, the top-down rationale that I've offered may seem not to account for the fact that departures from merit-based selection wrong the person who is not selected. In cases of discrimination, the basis of the wrong to a person is easy to identify. It is, as I said in my previous lecture, the harm of being excluded from valued positions and benefits and judged on grounds that are no good and judged to be inferior. The argument against discrimination, you might say, is thus bottom-up. It starts from an idea of a harm to an individual and complains about an institution that would inflict that kind of harm on an individual. But it might seem that the top-down explanation of what is wrong with nepotism or simple laziness in reading application folders makes these departures from merit-based selection a wrong only to the institution or to the employer of the selection officer. The complaint is just that this person is failing to do the job that he or she was employed to do. It's not a complaint, as it were, that can be made by the candidate who is rejected. The best answer to this objection, I think, draws on the plausibility of the three-level justification that I've started with. The overall justifiability of an inequality is a fully adequate response to someone's complaint. The overall justifiability of inequality is required in order to have a fully adequate response to a person's complaint about it. That's the way the three-level justification that I described arises, right? The person complains, why don't I have this advantage? The first step has got to be, well, giving that advantage to some people but not others has a justification. And then the rest, at least the second stage, is supposed to follow from that. So given that the second stage, that is the argument that the selection process fulfilled the requirements of formal equality of opportunity, follows from the first stage, and that those together are the appropriate package as a response to a complaint by a person, I think shows how the top-down justification becomes a response to the person. It doesn't look like that at first because the top-down part of it is you might say subsumed within a larger whole. It's only one step in the justification that has this top-down character. But when you look at the justificatory process as a whole, you can see why, taken as a whole, it arises as a response to a person's individual complaint. A third concern about the top-down rationale is that it may not cover enough cases. Suppose that more individuals qualify for selection than are needed. The top-down rationale seems to provide no objection to selecting among these by preferring one's relatives or one's former students. If they're all equally qualified, then I wouldn't be, as it were, subverting the purposes of the justification of the institution by choosing my nephew or my student or someone else. But this kind of selection may seem objectionable nonetheless. I have to say that I'm not certain what to say about this. Maybe what this shows is that selection by lot, as I said earlier, is required among candidates that are equally qualified. I don't know, but it does seem improper. A fourth worry, like the second, is related to the idea that the top-down rationale is too close to an argument from efficiency. If formal equality of opportunity is distinguished from non-discrimination, it may seem costless. Refraining from discrimination doesn't involve giving up anything one is entitled to. But merit-based selection, which I've argued is a different and stronger requirement than non-discrimination, merit-based selection has costs, not in requiring hiring or admission officers to forego preference for their relatives and friends, although that does have a personal cost, but not something we can complain about, I think. But as we all know, the sheer labor of screening the applicants and reading their folders is a significant cost both to us and to the employers and institutions that are paying us for our time. At least it would have that cost to them if they actually paid us for the time that we spend reading those folders. But as far as I can tell, they seem to regard faculty time as a free resource. But anyway, there's a cost there, right? So the question is, how careful must one be in order to fulfill the requirements of formal equality of opportunity, right? So even there, there's a question. The top-down rationale that I've offered may suggest an answer. One must put more time into screening applicants and interviewing them and so on, up to the point at which the marginal cost of a more thorough process would begin to outweigh the marginal increase that extra care would bring in advancing the ends that justify having the positions in question. Right? You've got to keep putting in more time until it doesn't pay off in greater efficiency for the institution. But it may seem that more than this is required to meet the requirement of fairness to the applicants. Right? Are we really meeting the requirement of fairness to the applicants if we're just going up to the level of efficiency? If this is right, this would suggest that there's a separate requirement of fairness independent of the top-down rationale that I've provided, and hence that rationale is not the complete explanation of formal equality of opportunity. I'm not certain what this further requirement of fairness might be, and not positive about how to respond to this objection. One way to do it would be, as I did in the first objection, to avert to the larger package, right? To justify the fact that this person doesn't have this advantage, I first have to justify a system that gives such advantages to some people but not others, and then have to justify the process through which people are selected for the position. And if I say, we've taken as much care as is justified by the justification for having the positions, maybe that amounts to enough. I have to say that it seems to me that there is something left out. But I also confess I don't yet know what it is. So this paper, I have to say, is the report of many years of thinking about this problem, in which I've not arrived at a totally satisfactory answer to it. But anyway, that's where I am. Okay, so much about formal equality of opportunity. I turn now to the question of what justification we can offer for the stronger requirement of fair equality of opportunity, which requires not only unbiased selection among candidates, but also the provision to everyone of the resources necessary for talented individuals to become good candidates. The top-down argument that I have just described does not support this more demanding requirement. If formal equality of opportunity, that is to say merit-based selection, is being observed, but nothing is being done to help poorer children become good candidates for positions of advantage, it doesn't seem to follow that individuals are being selected for these positions in a way that's incompatible with the justification for having those positions, in the way that this would be the case if formal equality of opportunity were being violated. Nothing seems to follow from the reason for having these positions of advantage about the amount that must be spent to make people good candidates for these positions. Perhaps the positions can be adequately filled by candidates perhaps the positions can be filled by candidates who are more than adequate for the job, without any such additional expenditure in training up and developing more potential candidates. So the top-down argument seems not to explain fair equality of opportunity, for something like the reasons that it seemed to have a problem in explaining how far you have to go in order to achieve formal equality of opportunity. The justification for the requirement of fair equality of opportunity seems to lie not in a top-down argument from the goals of the institution, but rather in some form of bottom-up argument based on what individuals can reasonably claim. This is, as I just ad-libbed, a version of the fourth potential objection to the top-down rationale for formal equality of opportunity, but in this case it seems to me to be a stronger objection. Before considering what a bottom-up argument for fair equality of opportunity might be, I need to have a closer look at what this version of equality of opportunity would require us to provide. To see what is required, it's important to distinguish between several different kinds of unequal position. There is, first, A, the inequality in the positions of advantage for which people are being selected. For example, the differences in income and special powers attached to particular offices, such as the role of judge or research scientist. Then there is, second, inequality in the specialized education that is needed to prepare a person to fulfill such a position successfully. So to get, some get this kind of education and some do not, just as some get the positions and some do not. Finally, there is inequality in the early childhood conditions and basic education that's required in order to exhibit the talents that these offices require, and in order to make the special education which prepares one for one of those positions worthwhile. The first two forms of inequality, inequality in the positions and inequality in specialized education that trains people for those positions, are, I believe, forms of inequality to which Rawls's difference principle applies. That is to say, having these forms of inequality are justified just in case giving these advantages to people with the requisite talents will make the worse off better off. This is the first level of justification in my three-level model. Now, it may be tempting to think of the specialized education of the kind involved in the middle step of what I was just talking about, specialized education like law school, scientific training, and so on, as one of the main things that needs to be provided in order to achieve fair equality of opportunity. But this was the subject of an objection to fair equality of opportunity that Richard Arneson made a number of years ago in an article attacking Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity. He said, fair equality of opportunity requires us to lavish too many resources on the talented. But that seems to me to be a mistake. The cost and difficulty of achieving fair equality of opportunity, the place where it would require us to invest resources, lies at the third level of inequality that I mentioned. That is, it lies in the cost and difficulty of supplying all children with the kind of early childhood environment and education that will enable them to develop intellectually in order for us to see whether they have talents that would then, under the difference principle, justify access to specialized training. So specialized training and specialized positions are part of the inequalities for which people are competing, right? And the problem of providing fair equality of opportunity is the cost of providing something to everybody, whether they're yet known to be talented or not, in order that we can properly discover whether they are talented and in order that they will have a fair chance to develop their talents so that they might qualify. Good conditions of this third kind are an important good for every child, considerations of equality of opportunity aside. It's therefore very plausible to claim that governments are obligated to provide such conditions for all children if the wealth of the society makes it possible to do so. It would then follow from the idea of equal treatment that I discussed in my first lecture that a government must provide such conditions for all children regardless of their social position. This would be parallel to the argument that if the state has an obligation to provide medical care, and given that it has this obligation, it must provide that care equally to all who qualify for it. In that case, it would be all who need it, as everybody who stands in need of medical attention. But the comparison with medical care brings out a potential objection. The benefit required by fair equality of opportunity seems to have an essentially comparative aspect that is lacking in the case of medical care, and lacking in the case of other benefits to which my equal treatment rationale would apply, as I argued in the first lecture. What fair equality of opportunity seems to require is a level of training that will allow the talented but poor to compete effectively with wealthier candidates, so that the choice between the poorer and the wealthier candidates will depend solely on their abilities and their willingness to develop and use them, rather than on their economic circumstances. By contrast, an argument from equal treatment doesn't in itself require a level of medical care equal to what the rich can provide for themselves privately, or so I believe. I don't know how this would play in Britain. When I gave a talk along this line in Canada, I got completely beaten up in the discussion period and all the way through dinner for the suggestion that it was permissible that there was an amount of medical care that the state had to provide for everybody, but it wasn't required in order to achieve equality, that the state should prevent the rich from hiring private doctors to top up the medical care that they get. Anyway, that's what seems to me to be the case about the medical care example. If everyone is provided with the level of medical care that government is obligated to give, whatever that level may be, it's no violation of equal treatment if some people are able to save up their money and hire something that's above this level. So the situation with regard to fair equality of opportunity seems to be like that discussed in my first lecture with regard to legal representation in civil cases. In addition to the requirement of equal treatment, there's the fact that the good that the government is obligated to provide has itself a competitive and therefore a comparative character. I said in my first lecture that the state needed to provide legal support for poor litigants in civil cases that enabled them to compete fairly with the richer litigants whom they had to oppose in court. So there's this comparative and competitive character to the very benefit that the state is obligated to provide. That doesn't seem to me to exist in the medical case. So what's required in the equal opportunity case is for us to provide conditions for children in poor families that are as good as those enjoyed by children in rich families, as far as this affects the development of their talents that would qualify them for special education and for positions of advantage. That is to say, this is what seems to me to be required by the idea of fair equality of opportunity as we understand it. But what I'm looking for is an explanation of why we have this requirement. Where does it come from? How can we justify it? Within the approach I'm currently taking, this takes the form of a question of why a just state has an obligation of the form I've described. In the case of civil litigation, the answer seems to be provided by an idea of the fairness of the legal process. So in the case of equality of opportunity, we might simply say that this obligation is required in order to ensure the fairness of the economic system. But it would be good to be able to say more if we could. Here, James Buchanan's explanation may offer some help. It is objectionable, he said, if those born into poor families are unable to play the game because of their comparatively poor starting places. One way to understand this is to incorporate it into the first level of the three-level justification that I described. The ability to give one's children a chance to qualify for positions of advantage is itself an important good. It's important not only because of the economic rewards attached to these positions, but also because these positions provide opportunities to exercise one's talents in a way that makes for a better and more satisfying life. If a system allocates this important good only to people in certain positions, this is a form of inequality that needs to be justified by the difference principle. And there's no reason to believe that such an allocation of benefits meets this test, right? We're imagining that we're justifying paying people in some positions more or giving people in some positions greater powers and political authority. And we justify those inequalities by saying giving some people those inequalities, provided that they have the relevant talents, will actually benefit everybody. But if people who are in those positions are able to ensure that their children are more able to get those positions in the next round of competition, that's an extra benefit that they've been assigned. So you've got to ask, does the difference principle justify? Is everybody made better off? Let's say, not only by having positions to which some special economic reward is attached, perhaps, and some particular powers and prerogatives of office are attached, but also there's this further benefit that's attached, which is being able to give your children a leg up on the next round. It seems very unlikely that benefit, that important form of inequality could be justified. So it may be that the justification, that the argument here lies at the first of the three levels of justification for which I distinguished earlier. Supposing that the state is required by justice to ensure that the benefits conferred on the better off that are justifiable do not bring with them this additional benefit of privileged access for their children to positions of advantage, how might this more demanding requirement be met? It might seem that there are two approaches to this problem. One is to do enough more for poorer children in order to match what the rich can provide by way of specialized education, private schools, tutors, whatever else. The other would be to limit what the richer parents can do for their own children. The former is very difficult, and the latter seems unacceptable. This dilemma seems to me too stark, and I'm going to argue that it's based on a faulty understanding of the problem. This is a new idea I've come to just in the process of preparing these lectures, so I'll be interested to find out whether you think it works. An alternative approach, which sees this dilemma as too stark, is suggested by what I said in my first lecture about the case of aid to litigants in civil cases. The alternative approach amounts to shifting the division of labor between formal and substantive equality of opportunity. The competition that gives the goods that need to be provided its comparative and competitive character is itself a social institution that requires justification. In the example I talked about in my first lecture, the system was the legal system, which can, in principle, be changed in a way that would make high-powered lawyers less of an advantage to competing litigants. In the present case, the system in question is the process through which candidates are chosen for specialized education, leading to better jobs, a process to which the requirements of formal equality of opportunity apply, supported by the top-down argument I went through earlier in my lecture. The way in which the good that a just government is required to provide for all in order to meet the demands of fairness is competitive, that degree to which the good that's provided will be competitive, not like the medical care case, but like the litigation case, will depend on the nature of the process through which candidates are selected for paths leading to positions of advantage. Suppose sufficiently good early childhood conditions and basic education were to be provided for all, so that those who have the talent qualifying them for specialized education leading to positions of advantage could be identified, whatever social position they were born into. It might still be true, as in the medical case, that the children of the rich will have developed their talents more fully at the stage when the tests are given. But if the selection process were administered in such a way that rich children are chosen for additional education, and hence ultimately for positions of advantage over their less well-prepared fellows, who are nonetheless equally talented and can be seen to be equally talented, this would be a violation of formal equality of opportunity, rather than just a violation of the more substantive version. So formal equality of opportunity requires selecting people on the basis of their potential, not on the basis of how far they've gotten in the development of that potential. So these children would be selected, would not be being selected for further education on the basis of the relevant kind of merit. If this is correct, then the advantageous position of the better off is in the first instance fundamentally a threat to formal equality of opportunity rather than to the substantive version. It is a threat insofar as the rich, if they have more, are able to distort and manipulate the selection process, not only by providing their children with fancy polish and extra education, but also through networking and connections in familiar ways. The primary threat to substantive, that is to say fair equality of opportunity, the third stronger requirement, is not wealth, but rather poverty, and its effects on early learning, on hope, and on the willingness to stay in school and work hard. If this is correct, then attaining substantive equality of opportunity remains an extremely difficult problem in an unequal society. My point is just that it is a different problem from the problem of limiting the advantages that the rich can give to their children. To the degree that this remains a problem, it will be due to defects, perhaps unavoidable defects, in the selection process itself. It will be because we haven't achieved formal equality of opportunity that substantive equality of opportunity requires providing a good with a competitive character. If formal equality of opportunity were achieved, then the good that we would need to provide everyone in order to achieve substantive equality of opportunity would simply be the good of being educated up to the point where you can see and others can see what your talents in fact are. That's not a competitive or comparative good. This brings me back to the question of motivation, which I mentioned above and set aside, since I said part of the problem is of achieving the substantive equality of opportunity is overcoming the conditions that undermine poor children's willingness to work. There is an ambiguity on this point in Rawls's formulation of the idea of fair equality of opportunity. According to the formulation that I quoted above, what's required is that, quote, those who are at the same level of talent and ability and have the same willingness to use them should have the same prospects of success regardless of their initial place in the social system. But Rawls goes on to state a stronger condition. Fair equality of opportunity is not achieved, he says, if due to unfortunate family circumstances, many people develop psychologically in such a way that they fail to make an effort and therefore fail to qualify for advantages for which they in fact have the talent. The latter, stronger claim is the one that seems to me clearly correct. Mere de facto lack of willingness or failure to try does not settle the matter unless the background conditions under which this failure is exhibited are themselves just. When we focus on this requirement that what we have to do is provide people who have the talent and the willingness to develop it to qualify for positions of advantage, when we focus on that motivational requirement, we invite ourselves to say, in justifying an inequality, well, yes, the inequality is justified, the process of selection is fair, and there's no unfairness in your failure to have the qualifications because you would have had them if you'd been willing to develop them, right? If we take seriously that motivational requirement, there's a danger of slipping into a kind of moralism, which is one of the pitfalls of the idea of equality of opportunity. The phrase equal willingness may suggest that when my third level of justification is fulfilled, when no unfairness is involved in the fact that the claimant has not developed the relevant qualifications, what we can say to the disappointed claimant is, you could have had this benefit if you had tried harder, so it's your fault that you don't have it. This is moralistic since it makes the justification for inequality depend, inappropriately, on a supposed moral failing of the claimant. It's his fault. And since willingness to try hard is naturally seen as a moral virtue, this is another place in which an idea of desert can make an illicit appearance, in the form of the idea that those who have tried hard are properly rewarded for their virtue, and those who have not tried hard rightfully suffer for their sloth. Both of these mistakes, moralism and illicit appeal to desert, can be avoided by being sufficiently clear that my third level of justification, that the claimant has no complaint about not having developed talents of the relevant kind, is not a claim about the claimant's moral character, how hard he or she tried, but rather a claim about what others, including the basic social institutions, have done for that person. The essential claim is that he or she has been put in good enough conditions to develop his or her talents and to develop a concern with doing so. We have done enough, therefore he or she has no complaint. The emphasis on the fulfillment of the third condition is on us. He's got no complaint against us. We did enough. The rest we properly left to you. This problem of motivation and conditions for developing it does not arise only in cases of the kind I've just been discussing, in which the unfortunate circumstances in question consist of poverty and its consequences. It arises as well in cases in which the factors at work are not economic or not purely economic, but cultural. Which people are likely to develop the willingness to make an effort, and what they're likely to develop a willingness to make an effort to do will depend on what they see as a real possibility for them and on what they come to value. And these things will be different for people growing up in different communities. Children growing up in communities as different as the old order Amish and the Roma may typically develop a willingness to make an effort for some purposes, but not for accomplishments of the kind that society rewards most highly. This may be so because, due to the outlook they are led to form in their community, they don't value these accomplishments or don't see those pursuits as real possibilities for them. Should we say then that equality of opportunity is not attained if people born into such communities do not have as good a chance to qualify for social advantages as equally talented members of other communities? An unequivocally negative answer seems to require us to overlook some cases of objectionable inequality. Children weren't provided with good enough conditions to decide what they might strive for. But an unequivocally positive answer, namely that we must provide such conditions for every child, seems to require interventions into family and community life that may seem objectionable. in order for equality of opportunity to be achieved. In its most general form, this problem can be seen as another side effect of the tendency to form non-comparing groups, which I discussed at the end of my second lecture. If the ambitions of children growing up in one group are limited to those of the adults in that group with whom they compare themselves, then they may be unlikely to make an effort to develop the talents that they in fact have, which would qualify them for other positions of advantage. On the account I'm offering, the justification for equality of economic opportunity has a dual character. Formal equality of opportunity is justified by a top-down argument. Sorry, I should say, I'm here starting a new position. I outlined this problem about the clash between the problem of intervening in communities just as a problem. I don't have a solution to it. I'm calling your attention to this tension. Now I'm shifting. On the account I'm offering, the justification for equality of economic opportunity has a dual character. Formal equality of opportunity is justified by a top-down argument starting from the goals that justify having the positions to which special benefits attach. Substantive equality of opportunity, the more demanding requirements of what Rawls called fair equality of opportunity, is justified by a bottom-up argument based on the obligation of a state to provide certain kinds of education to all of its citizens. This duality provides a satisfactory answer, I think, to the question of the scope of equality of opportunity. To whom is equal opportunity owed? I suggested earlier that, I didn't in this lecture, one might say that the differences in the quality of public schools in Massachusetts or within the United States as a whole might be objectionable in part because they violate equality of opportunity. But I don't think this objection applies to differences between schools in the United States and those in some foreign country, such as Britain or Switzerland, which probably have better schools, but that's not a violation of equal opportunity, not a violation of the obligations of the American government. One might say that this was because students within the United States are, at least potentially, all competing in the same job market. And this isn't true of students in the United States and students in some other country. But this explanation seems weak. After all, the students in one country can apply for jobs in another country, and they may have good reason to do so if those jobs are more desirable, or if there are no jobs at home. The dual account of equality of opportunity suggests an answer to this question. Perhaps not successful, but here's what it implies. The top-down argument for formal equality of opportunity is no respecter of national boundaries. Turning away more qualified foreign candidates would be just as contrary to the justifying aim of a position as turning away more qualified local candidates. But the substantive component of fair equality of opportunity derives from the obligations of a state to its citizens to provide every child with the kind of early childhood conditions and educational opportunities that will enable that child to develop the talents that he or she has. So it would be a violation of formal equality of opportunity to reject more qualified foreign applicants because they are foreign, but not a violation of substantive equality of opportunity if the ability of equally talented and equally motivated students to acquire the relevant training varies according to where they happen to live. Taken together, I think, and supplemented with an account of the wrongfulness of discrimination, the top-down and bottom-up arguments combined seem to me to offer as close to an adequate explanation of the case for equality of opportunity as I can come up with, and a basis for understanding what's required in order to achieve it. But I will now await your comments to tell me that this isn't the case. Thank you very much. Shall we move this out of the way?
I think they won't see the panel because it's quite low, so I suggest that each person come up and speak to the panel. So if the panelists want to come up here. Thanks. So I think if we were to turn this around so that each of you were to come up, they will see you and then go back down. So if all the panelists were to come up here, and Tim, you could take a chair, then do you think this will work? Because I think if you're all sitting there, they won't see it.
So do you want me to sit here so I can, because I will have to keep jumping up, I guess. So
you can have an exchange.
So what's happening, so we're just going to say something and then you say something immediately.
Yeah, apparently that seems to be Julian's plan.
So I think we'll start with David, then Janet, then John, and then if you grab a seat, and then we'll bring you up after each of the five. So our first
There's a few
panelist
pitfalls
is,
here.
David Miller.
Good. Thank you, Julian. It's a great honour and pleasure to be able to comment on these three splendid lectures that I think both beautifully crafted and overall highly persuasive. I find them so. I should say, by way of preface, that when I first read Tim's paper on the diversity of objections to inequality, which forms a kind of predecessor to these lectures, my reaction was not exactly like Bentham, when he first read Hume's treatise, said the scales have fallen from my eyes. My reaction wasn't quite that, I'm afraid. My reaction was something more like, damn, 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 because I thought that Tim had actually, what he said about the reasons for opposing inequality corresponded to what I intuitively thought myself, but he'd actually put it much better than I ever could, and so there was no room anymore to say something about objections to inequality that was worth saying. That was a bit of a shame. But these lectures, I think, have proved that not to be the case. I think there's a lot of new material here, very much worthy of our study, and very grateful to Tim himself that he's given us the text to pore over. So I'm just going to focus on two of the issues that were raised, not in the lecture today, but in the previous lectures. So one of them is about, and he's already anticipated this, the question of inequalities in health status, which he talked about briefly in the first lecture, and then the second is about the role of desert in justifying inequality, which he mentioned in the second lecture. And it seems as though I'm a bit to the left of Tim on the first issue, health inequalities, and a bit to the right of Tim on the second, desert. So if you recall, in the first lecture, talked about differences in life expectancy between different groups, either within a society or across different societies. But I'm taking this as just a more specific case of the wider phenomenon of inequalities in health status. So how do these arise? Well, I think this is pretty uncontroversial. There are sort of four types of factors that might explain these. First of all, genetic differences between people which give rise to differential liability to certain kinds of disease. Then second, individual decisions, lifestyle choices, for example, the choice whether or not to smoke. Third, the differences in access to healthcare, government-provided healthcare. And then finally, what I call social factors, such as the income someone earns or the place they occupy in the occupational hierarchy. And here I'm following what I think is a widely held view that factors of the fourth kind are actually an important explanation, partial explanation at least, of differences in people's health. Now I'm going to leave aside factors 1 and 2, just to focus on our response to factors 3 and 4. And Tim's view is that so long as we assume that a state has an obligation to provide health care to its citizens, it has a further obligation to treat them equally. That's to say, ensure that access to health care is the same for everyone, no matter what their race or social class and so on is. So inequalities arising from factor 3, say doctors being more responsive to middle-class patients than to working-class patients, these are objectionable. But according to Tim, this is not true of inequalities that arise from factor 4, at least so long as the social factors themselves don't represent objectionable forms of inequality. Now, it seems clear to me that whether we justify income inequalities by reference to Rawls' difference principle or in some other way, they're not in themselves objectionable. And the same is true of occupational hierarchies, which can often be defended on grounds of efficiency. It's not an injustice for a firm to have a managing director or a university a vice-chancellor, speaking generally here. But I think we are concerned when we learn that as a result of these justifiable arrangements, health inequalities emerge. That's not, by the way, because of some general commitment to luck egalitarianism. On this point, I stand with Tim. There's no general requirement to correct for unchosen advantage or disadvantage. But I think that the health inequalities do concern us. They give us a reason, not necessarily an overriding reason, to oppose inequalities of position that would otherwise be justified. That's a form of what's sometimes called specific egalitarianism, something special about health status that gives rise to concern when we discover it's unequally distributed as a consequence of institutions and practices that we've put in place. So one way of putting that is that I think that a state has to assume responsibility not just for ensuring equal treatment in the service that it provides itself, but also for the effects of institutions that it allows to exist under its aegis, such as markets, economic markets, and firms with occupational hierarchies or universities. So I'm offering Tim here the intuition, which he may or may not share, that when we find inequalities, along certain dimensions objectionable, even when this can't be presented as a case of unequal treatment by the state, though exactly which dimensions these are, whether health is just the only one or there are others as well, I think would need further investigation. That's the first set of comments. Now onto the second topic, which is desert, which I'm offering to Tim in a kind of constructive spirit, because I think some of his problems today about equality of opportunity might be eased if he were more willing than he is to embrace a notion of desert. So he's not a sceptic about desert in general, but he is a sceptic about desert when it's being used as a way of justifying economic inequality. And that also means that he's a sceptic about desert when it's being used to attack economic inequality. So when I suggested to him at the end of the first lecture that one main reason why people object to the huge inequalities in pay that we now see around us is because they don't see these inequalities as deserved by comparison to what middle income earners are getting. But he was not inclined to embrace that thought himself. Now, the problem with applying ideas of desert to income and other economic returns is not, according to Tim, the usual complaint about our natural talents being undeserved. Problem is, he says, there's no internal link in these cases between the grounds of desert and the item that's said to be deserved, as there is in the case of deserving blame. The rewards of economic activity are merely conventional, he thinks. Now, in one sense, that must be true. It's conventional that we choose to reward people for doing their jobs by giving them unequal amounts of money, as opposed to, I don't know, gold stars or medals or lengthy verbal tributes or whatever. But it does not seem merely conventional that we should reward people's performances differently, giving proportionately more to those who contribute more to the success of whatever enterprise they're engaged in. Now, as I suggested a moment ago, that can justify inequality, but it may also give grounds to limit it, where reward differences become disproportionate. There is certainly a big question about how performances are to be compared, especially across a large and plural society, and that can give rise to practical scepticism about the force of desert claims, for example, in the case of Hayek. But I took Tim's objection to be a different one, not about practical difficulty. I think that Tim reaches his conclusion about desert in a way that's fairly common among philosophers. That's to say, by beginning with the case of deserved blame, and then thinking that this holds the key to desert in general. That explains a remark he made during the question time yesterday, that desert is essentially a matter of the intention underlying an action. For example, one deserves blame for an action that displays ill will or malice. And that also allows Tim to present blaming behaviour, like withdrawal of association and so on and so forth, as internally connected to the actions it responds to. But if instead we start with the idea of praise rather than blame, it's clear that, except in certain special cases, that's directed at actions and achievements rather than the moral quality of the underlying intentions. When we applaud the leading singer at the end of the opera, or give a Nobel Prize to a scientist for something he discovered 50 years ago, we're concerned about what they did and not why they did it. The intention only matters insofar as it makes it their performance, not in terms of the motive for which the thing was done. To say that you can't really be deserving of praise or recognition except for your good intentions seems mysterious to me, because we both agree that a desert base doesn't have to be deserved. Now, in these cases, the form in which desert is recognised is conventional. So we applaud seminars by clapping the speaker. If you go to Germany, they rap on the table, just conventional. But that doesn't mean we can't deliver the right amount of recognition, indeed, the comparatively right amount in many cases. So theatre or opera audiences, responsible ones, have to be a bit sparing in their clapping as the minor characters appear, in order that they can rise to a suitable crescendo and the leads step forward, assuming that's what they deserve. So I can't see, therefore, why desert considerations should not play a role in our thinking about economic inequality. It's not the only role, but a role. They come into play when we object to women being paid less than men for doing what's essentially the same job. And they also come into play when we object to people being paid inordinate amounts for doing a reasonably straightforward job like running a bank or a building society. Desert is not inherently egalitarian in general, but in these cases at least it serves an egalitarian purpose. So, just to conclude, I agree wholeheartedly with Tim that there are a number of distinct grounds for objecting to inequalities. These have been treated in the lectures. What I've just tried to do here is suggest two further grounds. Dante's already a long list. That's to say, our specific concern for equality of outcome in dimensions such as health, and then secondly, our concern that people should get what they comparatively deserve, including things like pay and benefits.
Thank you very much, David, for those thoughtful and generous comments. On the first, if I understood you correctly, I don't think that we actually disagree. Your fourth category was differences in health that arise from differences in employment, and from economic differences. So it's well known, well documented, that in an unequal society, poorer people tend to be less healthy, even if medical care maybe is being provided. Something about the experience of being worse off in a society, or having to do the kind of jobs that people like that have to do, that one tends to be less healthy. And contrary to what it may have seemed from what I said, I do think that can be an objection to inequality. That's an objection to economic inequality based on its consequences. And I listed a bunch of objections based on their consequences. I probably should have said there probably are more, and effects on health might be some of them. I didn't explore the possibility that economic inequality was objectionable because of its impact on people's health, because I thought that took me too far away from what seemed to be genuinely egalitarian worries. Being caused to have poor health is itself a harm. it's not a kind of, it's not the inequality of people's health that's caused by economic inequality that's objectionable. It's the fact that some people are sick, they're neurotic, they're depressed, or they have other things. Now, of course, you might say, well, health itself is a comparative idea and socially variable, and I concede that, but what I would want to say is, look, what's objectionable, one of the things that can be objectionable about economic inequality is that the experience and the conditions of work of being a poor person in an unequal society can lead to ill health, and I think that is an objection, and I probably should have put it on my list. Desert is a more complicated matter. I said quickly that a desert-based justification was a justification that said there's some characteristic of the person or what he or she did that calls in itself for a certain kind of differential treatment. Now that's rather broad because you might say the fact that some people are in need, for example, that they're in need of medical care is a fact about them that calls for some particular treatment. I wouldn't want to say that was a claim of desert, it's a claim of need. So claims of desert are a little more special. You might say a claim of desert, and this is what I said in ad-libbing in my lecture, that there's some merit shown by what the person is like or what he or she has done, or merit or demerit, I guess I should say, which calls in itself for some particular treatment. Now, this kind of merit could be moral merit, and that's the kind of case in which I was assessing yesterday in my response to Ingmar Persson, where I said that's mainly a matter of the person's intentions and values that are exhibited in their action. But I wouldn't deny, as David very nicely brings out, that people can also deserve praise or criticism for their performances, for the excellence of what they do. I wouldn't deny that at all, and I do think that praise for achievement of excellences in accomplishment is something that can be justified on a pure desert basis. But I wanted to argue that differential rewards differential economic rewards in the economy couldn't be justified on this sort of a basis. There wasn't the right kind of connection between economic contributions and particular kinds of economic rewards to make this a good desert basis. So I said that was merely conventional, although we do think that there are such things, but I wanted to argue that they were merely conventional. And this puts me at a disadvantage if I want to argue against some forms of inequality by saying that they aren't deserved, right? The extra rewards of people in the finance industry maybe aren't deserved. That would be one objection. And I can see why one would say that. Indeed, I might be tempted to say it myself. But I think in that case, desert is being used in an overly extended form. To say that these extra rewards aren't deserved is just to say there's no justification for them of any kind. There's no point in conferring extra advantages on people for that sort of reason. So in the case of women being paid less than men are paid for the same kind of a job, I want to say there's no justification for paying men more than women if they're doing exactly the same thing. I don't have to bring in the idea of desert in order to say that. So I'd like to think that although people use the word desert in this broader sense, in many cases when they use that word, it should be cashed out in other ways other than the narrow desert basis idea that I was singling out. Now that may seem evasive, pedantic, academic, but it seems to me one of the things that philosophy can contribute to these debates is to introduce useful distinctions. When we say that men don't deserve to be paid more than women, what do we mean by that? And I think we simply mean that this extra payment isn't deserved. It's arbitrary. There's no ground for it. Although conventionally, it might be customarily accepted that men's work was better rewarded than women's work, but that was, I think, simply a mistake. I'm not suggesting that David was speaking in favor of that.
Do you want to make any responses, or you can probably stay up here if you want. Tim, do you want to?
We're going to stay up there. Okay, yeah, sure.
We've got a couple more minutes.
Well, thank you, David. So on the first point, I was trying to make a point, not about the poor health that might result from position, but inequality.
The unequal health, yes.
So you didn't say directly whether you thought that there might be some particular goods whose equal distribution was in some sense required, not because, for example, as in the case of your legal aid
Yes.
situations,
Because it was competitive. Yeah.
because it's competitive, but just because that kind of good should be, insofar as differences arise from something like a basic structure or something of this sort, which we are in the position to control, they are objectionable to that extent, just as inequalities.
Right. Well, let's see. So it might say it's a product of having a basic structure that allows for certain positions of relative wealth and income. That people in some of these positions will be healthier than people in the other in other positions, right? And you might think of that as an inequality that's, as it were, created by the basic structure. I'm not inclined to think that's what's objectionable there is the inequality. It's repeating. I think it's that what's objectionable is that people should be caused to be unhealthy by being forced to work in positions that harm their health. And so I'm inclined to think that the health there is a harmful side effect, which is a reason for objecting to such things. But I'm just repeating myself. Sorry about that. But that's what I would say. I'd like to come up with an example or something that would solidify the point. I'll think about it while I'm going on. Maybe something will come up. Sorry.
Well, we saw these papers a couple of days ago, and on first reading through, I had certain ideas, and then I read it again, and I thought I'd misunderstood, and then I got further. It's incredibly dense, and if you have taken all this in one reading, you're a great deal better than I am. So I'm going to ask Tim largely for clarifications of areas where I rather feel as though I'm coming from completely the wrong direction, and I want to know exactly whether I'm getting things wrong. And I want to pick on the elements that he did in today's lecture. A satisfactory response to the complaint that two people were unequal. And he said there were 3 claims involved, and there were 3, just to remind you. One of them might be supported by saying the inequality satisfied Rawls's difference principle or some other kind of principle. Second is the formal equality of opportunity one, which I'll come to in a moment. And the third is this substantive one, the Rawlsian fair equality of opportunity. Now, the first one, the matter of whether it is justified to have unequal rewards for certain activities, whether somebody finds the difference principle an adequate reply to that will, of course, depend on whether they accept the difference principle in the first place, and they may accept something completely different, like an extreme utilitarian view or whatever, as Tim allows for. So who is going to be satisfied by this will depend on what principles they hold about this kind of thing. So that strikes me as fair enough, except that it's a bit much to say that the society must actually exemplify this, because none of us has the faintest idea how to produce a society which exemplifies Rawls's difference principle. What really the principle does is give the criteria for assessing whether society is getting better or worse. It doesn't tell you how to achieve a complete end, it just gives you the criteria for assessing. And if the society is doing its best in that respect, then the person has no complaint, that's fine. Now the second one, and this is where I really do think I have misunderstood something, the formal equality of opportunity. I kept thinking I'd grasped it and then thinking later that I hadn't. Applies to the process of selection among those who present themselves as candidates for some position, and it says that it mustn't be given to candidates on the basis of factors that are irrelevant, which is clear enough. But then Tim says, this rules out discrimination on racial or other grounds, nepotism, other kinds of favoritism, as well as failure to consider candidates on their merits out of pure laziness. Now, what I'm inclined to think is there are two separate issues going on here, and I don't know what to say about this. It was the case, I believe, under slavery, that the slaves were forbidden to learn to read. Now, this seems like a paradigm case of what we would call discrimination. And the people who justified this said it was because the slaves were not capable of reading. Africans were not up to this. Now, this comes into the category, I think, of what Tim would say regarding a group as inferior or unworthy or something like that. But in fact, the reason why it's so absurd, obviously, is that if the slaves can't read, then there is, as John Stuart Mill would say, not the slightest purpose in forbidding them to do it. Whereas conversely, if they are capable of reading, what that rule does is prevent the ones who can read, who could read, would be able to, from reading. So it's clear that their belief, if they had it, in the inferiority of their black slaves was not really what this was about. What it was really about was making sure they stayed inferior by not being able to read. Now, the point about that rule is that saying you aren't allowed to read because you can't read is an irrelevance. It's obviously nothing to do with the general principles which were running the society. And much the same occurred when women were trying to get emancipation, and the men said women were not up to doing men's work. And as Mill said, it's no use forbidding women to do what they can't do. This only got point if they can do it. But then suppose you have a completely different kind of system. Suppose you're not in 19th century England, but you're in ancient Sparta or Nazi Germany or something. And the whole idea is that the point is that if you're saying the slaves aren't allowed to learn to read, what you're doing is arbitrarily imposing a disadvantage on them which you can't justify in your own terms. But supposing you're in Nazi Germany or Sparta, and you think that the whole purpose of the state is to conquer other states, and therefore women should remain at home and be forced to bring up children and breed as many as possible, of whom some will be the soldiers and they will go out and get killed. So women are not given any opportunities for education other than they need, and men are forced to go into martial arts and such like, whether they want them or not. Now, a society like that, in saying men and women should have separate education, would not be one that I think is open to complaint on grounds of discrimination. That is, it would not be the difference in the treatment of men and women that was wrong. It would be the whole basis of what the state was trying to do. And the point is, if discrimination is arbitrary, then it depends on what it's arbitrary relative to. So there's two completely different kinds of complaint. One is that the people who are discriminating against you, disadvantaging you, can't give a justification in their own terms of what they're doing to you. So it's simply a disadvantage to you. And the other quite different kind of complaint is that they're trying to achieve completely the wrong kind of thing. And it seems to me that if your complaint is that they're trying to achieve the wrong kind of thing, you're back in this first category of the kinds of...
Right.
Yes. And I think also this means that things like nepotism and other kinds of favoritism may come into it, because you might want a society, you might find, as you calculated harms and benefits, that it was good to allow people to appoint their own relatives to certain things. You have a substantive question here for liberals about where to put the limits of individual preferences and where to insist on absolute impartiality. And that, again, is one of these questions that comes into the first category, not the arbitrary discrimination category. I haven't got much time and I forgot to look at the clock. Very quickly then, fair equality of opportunity. I have real puzzles with this one. What very often happens in discussions of equality of opportunity is people say, well, let's make a level playing field, let's have equality of opportunity, and then other people come along and say, oh, but that's not fair to the people who haven't got the natural abilities, and they say, let's have equal probability of achieving the outcomes, and Rawls does a kind of combination of the two. Now, the question is why we should be inclined to these ideas of fairness at all. The models for these ideas of fairness, one is of a level playing field, or setting up a fair arrangement before some kind of competition. If we want to find out who has the best team, we want a level playing field so that the outcome is entirely determined by who's best, and it's unfair if the initial conditions make things better for one rather than the other. So that's one kind of intuition about fairness. Another kind of intuition we have about fairness and outcomes is that of a lottery, a fair lottery. In a fair lottery, every ticket must have an equal probability of winning. And in both these cases, the thing we're setting up at the beginning, the initial conditions, are to determine fairly the means to some further good, namely who is going to win. Now this means that if you're going to take a model of a fair society on these lines, it's no good saying, here is a context in which we can see clearly what's a fair starting position, and another one where it is, because our question now is, should our whole society be set up like a game with equal starting positions, or like a lottery with equal probability of winning? Or should we set up our society in some completely different way? And I think it's easy to do quite a lot of thought experiments which show that most of us don't feel at all inclined to set up the whole society as if it were a matter of a level playing field or equal lottery tickets. Suppose, for instance, you've got a number of people and half of them have shoes and half of them haven't. What's your response to this? Now, if they are about to run a race and half of them have had their shoes stolen, then you quite happily level down. You say, let's take them away from the others so that they have a fair starting position in the race. But if you have half the people with shoes and half without, and it's a cold winter, there seems no point at all in saying that fairness is like the starting position for a race. Because if you take away, if you level down, and this again is something I think Tim would agree with, if you take away the shoes from the people who've got them, you do nothing but harm. You don't advantage the others. So if we don't see society as a competition to get something else, if we're just considering whether we want to make things better, there's a limit to the point of leveling playing fields. And the same with lottery tickets. Supposing we want equal probability of achieving a particular end, like being Prime Minister, and we say, how do we give people equal probabilities by giving them equal starting points? To start with, we couldn't possibly do it, and it would take an enormous amount of resources. And if we're really concerned with the fairness of the competition, then what we would do is say, draw lots, or something like that. Or make sure that everybody can do it by this way, if the fairness of that sort of thing is the main criterion. And I think in the case of the Rawls equality, I'm going through this part quickly, in the case of the Rawls equality of opportunity, you could completely satisfy the Rawls criterion, I think, by the Fishkin expedient of swapping around children by lot at birth, so that they have equal probabilities of equal abilities coming out at the end. Now, nobody wants a society like that, as far as I can see. It looks as though our intuitions about these matters are not about fair competitions for something. It's not that we're wanting opportunity as a thing to control so that for achieving something else. It looks as though opportunity, in some sense, is what we want as an end in itself, not as a controlled means to achieving some other end. Which means that I think a lot of us see intuitively opportunity along the lines of something like sense capabilities and functionings, or primary social goods of a wider sort. That is, things it's worth having anyway, not things which we want primarily as a means to getting something else. And if that's the case, we don't have to worry about this business of starting position for a competition, because opportunity of this sort could be adjusted in its amounts throughout the whole of life. It isn't a matter of winner takes all from a starting position. And in that case, if I'm right about this, this also becomes part of the first criterion in being something we have to decide what kinds of things do we want to apply the difference principle to if we're going to accept the difference principle. And if we're going to apply it to things like capabilities and functionings, rather than seeing opportunity as a fair starting point in a race for something else, then my suspicion is that this third one would collapse into the first. So you'd only have two questions. One would be, how do we keep adjusting society to make it better by whatever criteria we're using? And the second would be the anti-discrimination. Nobody should be disadvantaged without being able to be offered a justification in terms of the principles that we're accepting. Does that make sense?
It makes good sense, yes. Thank you. Thanks.
I don't think you disagree.
Hung up on electronically.
I don't think you disagree
David's
at
chair.
all, actually. I'm just trying to find where the...
There we go. Well, one of the main innovations in the last iteration of my revisions of this material was the introduction of this idea that I called the three-level justification, and the idea that the key to understanding our thinking about equality of opportunity rests in getting the proper division of labor between these three levels of justification. And Janet has confirmed my sense that this was indeed a step forward, although it might not have been a step far enough forward to please her. It seemed to me that the objections to the institutions she was discussing in the slave case and the Nazi case were objections, as she correctly said, to the idea of having these kinds of inequalities at all, namely that they are not justified. And I felt that her Janet's very correct remarks about such cases made me feel justified in the paragraph in the text that I read you when I talked about the University of Texas Law School and said that it might be an objection to what I'm saying, that it makes the criteria for selection too dependent on the aims of the institution in question. And I said, yes, it does that, but it makes the merit on the basis of which people are selected is going to actually have real justificatory weight only if the aims for the institution have real justificatory weight. So it's not, what merit selection is not relative to what people see as the purpose of the institution and the inequalities that it involves, but rather what actually would justify them. If nothing justifies them, then the whole justification collapses, right? In order for the justification for the difference in what I have and what someone else has to be successful, it has to succeed at all three levels. So that's what I would feel about that case. Now, skipping to the third level, that is the fair equality of opportunity, one of the things that happened to me in the process of revising this in the later stages was to shift from thinking that the good that's being provided, that the state is obligated to provide to people in order to fulfill that third requirement, was an essentially comparative good, like the good that's involved in allowing people to participate fairly in tort law. To the conclusion, no, the good that the state has to provide everybody with there is essentially a non-comparative good. It's something that everybody has reason to want, namely to have good enough conditions to develop up to the level of figuring out what talents they have and to be in a good position to decide how one wants to use those talents and which ones one wants to prefer. I said if that condition is fulfilled, then all the requirements of equality of opportunity lie at the second level in the criteria of selection, so the point of the provisions of education, special early childhood conditions, and so on, the point of those is providing something that's a good for everybody non-competitively. And you might say, it might be right, that what we need to describe what has to be provided there and for measuring the degree to which a given state has fulfilled that requirement might look something very much like Sen's idea of capabilities. Right? We want to have a capability set that allows us to choose among various functionings and to be in a good position to make that choice. That would seem to me to be quite right. So I agree about that, but I don't feel that it's necessarily a departure from what I took myself rather obscurely and densely to be saying. Third idea has to do with what's happening at the stage of selection. Now, possibly, it might be that a lottery would be a better method of selection at that stage. Maybe, whether that's true might be based on, as it were, efficiency considerations. How much would be lost if instead of selecting people for special positions of advantage that are justified in whatever way they're intended to be justified at the top level, were made on the basis of a lottery rather than on the basis of carefully discerning who has the relevant talents. Even if we were to decide that that's the way we should carry out selection for positions to which special advantages are attached, that would not weaken the case at the third level for providing the kind of early childhood conditions that are necessary, right? That's provided because that's a good for everybody to have, whether there are any economic inequalities in the society or not. So the question of whether it would be better to have selection by lot or selection by merit, I meant to be saying, well, I imagined a case where all we need is somebody to stand in the director's chair and solve the coordination problem of which side of the road we're going to drive on or something like that. That doesn't require any special talent, but you might say everybody might like to have their moment in the sun and play this role. If that were the case, then we can just do that by lot. It would be arbitrary and discriminatory to choose people with red hair or people who can do calculations very fast or people who studied philosophy or something else. So the question of whether, with respect to other roles that have a more substantive content, we might as well do better. We would do better to select by lot or to select on the basis of some scrutiny of what talents people have would depend perhaps on efficiency. How much would be lost by way of the degree to which having these positions makes us all better off or makes the worst off better off or whatever our criterion is. How much would be lost relative to that justification if we used a system of lotteries rather than a system of careful selection, looking at it from the point of view of someone who's about to go home and have to read a stack of folders that would be this tall if it were on the ground, and now they're online, which makes them even more difficult to read, even though they take up less space. I might say, yes, let's choose new appointments and admit graduate students by lot. Although I'm not really sure I want that, right? I don't think I want to live with the consequences. Although, on the other hand, it would ease personal relations. It would avoid the worries that I mentioned about a rigid meritocratic society that I mentioned at the end of my previous lecture. But still, I think I wouldn't favor it. But I do want to come back to the idea that my idea of the reasons for providing better early childhood education and so on aren't primarily reasons of equalizing starting points in a competitive race, but rather the reasons that that's something that everybody needs to have to live a good life, and therefore something that a just government ought to provide. So, thanks.
Yes, I found them. I could find everything. Somewhere.
Well, thank you, Tim, for the lectures. It's tradition in commentating that you take up something from the lectures that you disagree with, but actually I couldn't find anything like that. It's not to say that I agreed with every word, but I didn't disagree with any of it. So what I'm going to do instead is add stress to something, if there's time, two things that Tim did say and that I do agree with. The first actually was something that initially I thought he had left out. It's a very elementary point, but nevertheless very fundamental point. And to begin with, I thought, well, I had detected something missing from these lectures. It was this basic point. But in fact, he did mention it in answering questions last night. He said it was something that was in that paper he kept mentioning, the short paper that underlay the long lecture that he gave. And somehow a lot of the very interesting things in the short paper didn't actually appear in the long lecture. That was something to do with earning his fee from the Uehiro or something. I'm afraid we can't understand the explanation of that entirely.
I can't understand it either.
But at any rate, I do know that Tim agrees with what I'm going to say, because he did say it was in the short paper. What it is simply this, that nowadays we recognize that every person matters. And indeed we recognize that everybody matters equally. Everybody counts the same. But it doesn't follow from that there's a reason for having equality between people. Counting everybody equal, or everybody mattering equally, does not imply that it matters that everybody is equal. That's something else, and it takes a further step in order to arrive at that question. I think that's an obvious point, and as he said it, that it's obvious, but I think it needs stressing, and I think it can contribute to thinking about equality to recognize it. So here's an example that I took from the lecture, in fact. This is Tim's reporting on an argument of Rawls's, arguing for equality. I should say this in a bridged quotation. The parties in the original position are equal members of a society seen as a cooperative enterprise. It is as cooperating members of this enterprise that they have claims to the goods that their cooperation produces. Since they're equal cooperating members, none of them has, at the outset, a stronger claim on resources than others. That is why, in the original position, they're symmetrically placed, leading to the initial appeal of the benchmark of equality. Now, do you see the non sequitur in that last sentence? It's just the one that I was pointing out. People are symmetrically placed. They've all got the same claims as each other. But that by itself does not show that there's anything to be said for equality between people. Something else is required. Now, I think it's fairly obvious, and you will see that it's fairly obvious in a moment, what that something else is, but it is something else. And it needs mentioning. So there's got to be a bit more to that argument that comes out of Rawls than that. Oh, and let me say, that wasn't a bridge quotation. It omitted some sentences that help to close the gap, but do not completely close the gap. So it was a slightly unfair quotation there. So we've got to find a different element to add. Let me just give another example to stress the point that I'm making. Suppose there's some good that has to be distributed among a number of users. And suppose there's no more reason to use it one way than to use it another way. Does that mean it should be equally distributed among the uses? No, it doesn't. For example, suppose that you've got a deadline to meet for your book or your thesis, and it's in a terrible mess, and all the chapters need work, and you just don't have time to do enough work on any of these chapters to get it back up to shape, and they're all equally bad, so each of them requires, there's an equal reason for giving attention to each of them. Does that mean you should work on the chapters equally? No, of course it doesn't mean that. There may be considerations one way or the other, but the mere fact that there's an equal reason for working on them doesn't mean that you should work on them equally. And we might even, in describing your position about your book or your thesis, we might use the language of claims, which is one that comes up naturally here, and the one that is in that quotation I just read from Tim. We might say that each chapter has a claim on your time. It needs work on it. But even so, even though they've each got a claim on your time, it doesn't mean that you should divide your time equally. So why not? Why doesn't that work in the case of chapters, and it does seem to work in the case of people? Well, it's obvious. It's because between people there's an issue of fairness, which there is not between chapters in a book. You don't have to be fair to the chapters in the book. And we could say, if we wanted to add this remark, that there's an explanation of why there's an issue of fairness, and that is, in the famous phrase, the separateness of persons. To illustrate that, let me ask you to think about a mother bird returning to her nest with a beak full of food, and finds in the nest 5 gaping beaks, all grabbing for this food. And she's got equal reason to feed each of these beaks. Has she got reason to distribute the food equally? Well, probably not, because she's a bird. And birds maybe don't do reasons, but just ignore that factor in the story. If you ignore that, yes, she has got reason to distribute it equally, and that's because there are 5 different chicks, 5 separate chicks, and therefore there is an issue of fairness between them. If these 5 gaping beaks were actually all attached to the same chick, if it was a big chick with 5 mouths, then she would have no reason to distribute the food equally between the beaks. But because there's separateness of chicks, she should distribute it equally. So, equality of reasons gives us no reason for equality of distribution. We need a quite separate ingredient in the argument, and that ingredient is fairness. And furthermore, we can add that equality of claims does not in itself give a reason for equality of distribution. Again, we need fairness. That's not so obvious in the case of claims, because in some senses of claim, the idea of fairness is actually embedded in the sense of claim. They are what you might call fairness claims. Often when we talk about claims, we're talking about fairness claims. But fairness anyhow has to be added in. Now, I think this is a useful thing to bear in mind when we're thinking about equality, when we're thinking about what sorts of equality are good and what's good about them, because fairness is actually a more general notion than equality. Fairness has applications outside egalitarianism, so we can think in general about fairness and use what we learn to tell us something about the value of equality. For example, this is just a very simple example. Fairness is particularly a matter of relative. It's a relative matter. It's about how some people fare relative to other people. And in the cases we've been talking about, what it requires is actually equality. Fairness requires equality between people who have equal claims. It's not something that can be achieved by promoting some overall value or something like that. It is interested in the relative position. So this tells us that the value of equality cannot be substituted for by something else, such as giving priority to the worse off, which is something about to do with promoting value. That isn't a replacement for caring about equality itself. And we also now have different questions to think about that's given us by recognizing this role of fairness. What fairness requires is equal satisfaction of equal claims, and more generally, proportional satisfaction of claims in proportion to those. So we can now focus our attention on what are these fairness claims? Where do they come from? They're certainly not the same as rights. Fairness is not the same as justice. And we can do some sorting out, asking what these fairness claims, where they come from, what's the basis of them, what they can consist in, and that will help us in figuring out, for example, whether we should be interested in equality of health or inequality of healthcare. Do people have equal fairness claims to health, or alternatively, do they have equal fairness claims to healthcare? Well, this gives us questions to answer, to look at in understanding what we should think about equality.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That does give me much more to think about. And I agree with almost everything you said, but I'll try to elaborate on some of the things. We don't need to be fair to chapters. We don't need to justify ourselves to chapters. Right? We need to justify ourselves to individuals. We have to respond to their claims somehow. That seems right. And I also think that whether the need to justify ourselves to all these different claimants directs us toward equality depends on what their claims are. That the mother might give more food to the chick that was the weakest or the sickest, and that wouldn't be unfair, I don't think. So this is the moral I was taking from my analysis of the example from Ronald Dworkin's Sovereign Virtue, where the question was how the father ought to distribute his estate among his various children. And I said, if we think of their claimants as being like the chicks, as in my example, that is claims on the father because he's has a duty to take care of them, then an unequal distribution corresponding to their different needs and circumstances might be quite justified and I think not unfair. Whereas if we simply think that the estate, as it were, belongs to them, then you've got to ask the question, well, why should any one of them acquiesce in or accept an unequal distribution? And that brings us to the difficult corner that John correctly identified in my discussion of Rawls's original position. That paragraph was a little bit compressed. I didn't want to take you too far into the weeds of Rawls' interpretation, but I did distinguish between two things. One, what's going on in Rawls's original position, and second, what's the argument for setting things up so that that's what goes on, right? Now, the easy thing is to say, why does Rawls think that the parties in his original position would arrive initially at a benchmark of equality? The first thing they should say, well, there's no reason why we shouldn't just take an equal distribution. And then he says they might move away from that if moving away from that would make everybody better off. They couldn't object except out of envy to such a move. But what's the rationale for the initial benchmark of equality? I take it within the original position, this rationale is provided by what might be called Rawls's reductive strategy. The original position says, in order to define what the appropriate principles would be for a certain role in society, we should ask what principles would be chosen by people under certain conditions, behind a veil of ignorance and so on, who were motivated simply by trying to ensure the best outcome for themselves and those they represent that they can. And his argument for the benchmark of equality is, well, given that they don't know what position they're in, they have no reason to acquiesce in an unequal distribution. It would be like a blind gamble. I have no reason more reason to think I'm in one position than another. So why should I acquiesce in a principle that would favor one position rather than another? Why should I acquiesce in something that might bring me less an equal position for what I can so far see to be no good reason. Now maybe that's not a sufficiently good argument within the original position, but I'm just trying to say that the step is supposed to be bridged by a calculation about what the person should see as in their own personal advantage if they have to choose behind the veil of ignorance. But then the more interesting question is, why should we care from the point of view of deciding what principles of justice to accept, what people would choose under those conditions? And I offered a rationale that Rawls doesn't himself offer. Here I was ad-libbing. I gave this supposed analogy of the partners in a firm. I said, suppose a group of us get together and form a business, and we bring to the firm the same initial capital. We contribute the same amount of effort. No one of us has an idea that the other one didn't contribute, and we work. The firm succeeds. We sell it off, and then the question is, how are we going to divide the profits? I said, you might say, there's no reason for one person to acquiesce in less than an equal share than the others are getting under those conditions. Well, why would one think that? Well, I tried to enumerate the kind of reasons that somebody might offer. I worked harder than you did. I contributed more capital in the beginning. It was my idea, and you guys just came along for the ride depending on my idea. I was trying to rule all those things out. And the point was that didn't leave any reason why one person should acquiesce should accept a justification for taking a less than equal share. Now, maybe that argument isn't successful, but that's an attempt to give, as it were, a substantive moral argument for equality, given certain assumptions. Certain reasons might possibly be reasons for inequality, but if you rule those out and take the background that I've assumed, what's left by way of a justification for why a person should accept less? As I said, Rawls doesn't offer that argument, although he describes society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, and that suggests the analogy that I have mentioned, and he gives very subsidiary arguments about why particular talents in themselves don't justify unequal distribution. So I think he's justifying screening out from the original position factors of the kind that I was screening out in my little fable that I told you. But I tried to emphasize in the last part of my first lecture that to say that fable and the conditions I built into it are the hold in the way that we ought to look at society is a big step. And so we've got a substantive moral move to say that everybody who participates in a modern society, whatever role they have in that society, should be seen as in a position analogous to the position of the people setting up this firm together. That's in a way an appealing egalitarian idea, but it's a very substantive step. So I very much agree with John that there is a move there to be papered over. We have to get to an equal a claim to substantive equality in some way from the fact that everybody, unlike the chapters in his book, has a claim on us. And in my first lecture, I tried to distinguish two possible forms that the claim might take. One was a claim to equal treatment that would fit the health care and the nourishment case, perhaps. And the other would be a claim to equal resources. And I said maybe there are other grounds for making such a claim to equal shares, and I'd be interested to know what they are, although I haven't thought of any yet. Thanks very much.